Permitted stand part of the question, and I call the member for Goldstone.
Thank you, Deputy Speaker. And Deputy Speaker, imagine my shock. Imagine everyone else in this chamber's shock that the Labor Party would oppose efforts which make it deliberately mischievous for litigation funders to be able to turn our court system from one focused on justice to one focused on profit for themselves and the lawyers that represent them. Imagine my shock when you go through their AEC returns and the same people who benefit and prey on the unfortunate misfortune of the low income, the poor and those who've faced challenges also happen to be those who profit from the current law that the Labor Party is seeking to oppose amendment of. And imagine my shock when those same lawyers, those same firms who take advantage of the misfortune of Australians and profit from it might also be some of the most significant donors to the Australian Labor Party. Imagine my shock, Deputy Speaker, at the motivation of those members opposite, and particularly when they sit in this chamber, stand in this chamber, and talk about how they worry about a culture of don't ask, don't tell within Australian companies. Yet when we moved a motion in the chamber this morning, the member for Mackellar moved a motion in this chamber this morning calling out major superannuation funds who choose to keep information secret, not just from their investors, because we know on the public record that they have complained about the secrecy that sits at the heart of these funds. Not just from the fund members who invest money in super funds that is then laundered into wholesale funders and can't get accountability, while they pay their fund managers fat bonuses. But imagine when they won't even answer questions to this parliament. If you want to see don't ask, don't tell, just look at what happens in the superannuation industry, where big super harvests actively members' funds for fees and bonuses and then refuse to reveal them to the Australian public. Just look at what happens when fund managers caught up in cases of an alleged sexual harassment are boasting to their victims about $36 million bonuses for themselves, and the silence on the other side of this chamber. And it's not just the bonuses that they brag about in bars late at night, but about the publicly reported $13 million bonuses that they actually collect by single fund managers from Australia's retirement savings. And when this parliament and the committees that represent it ask questions not just about the bonuses but their structures, and not just that they refuse to answer and engage in their own don't ask, don't tell policy, but the members of the Labor Party on the other side of this chamber run interference to try and help block the release. And then they come into this chamber where we are proposing sensible laws to stop the abuse of people who try and use courts for profit and not for justice, and attack sensible legislation which would empower and enhance the opportunity for all Australians to be treated fairly and with dignity. That is the tragedy of the modus operandi of the opposition and the legislation and how they view it. It is not about what we can do, what they think they can do to empower the Australian people. It is what they can do to empower themselves. And the Australian people see this deep down, that they will not take action unless it helps themselves at the people of Australia's expense. The measures in this legislation are very straightforward. As we know, at the start of the COVID-19 pandemic, because of the incapacity to bring people together for investor meetings and shareholder meetings, we provided a legal vehicle for those meetings to be held virtually and online. And while this government has a very proud track record of rolling out vaccines, we are not at the end of that journey. And returning to business as normal is not an option, but it is only a temporary measure. And it's a temporary measure because we want not just Australians to come together, but because we know that when the channel in which people can communicate is limited, it favours the boards against investors. And we want to empower investors and Australians who can make their decisions and hold boards accountable. And even with this legislation, it will still be greater than superannuants and investors in Australian superannuation funds can hold many of their funds accountable, because they report not to their members, despite the best efforts of this government and legislation, not to independent directors, but ultimately to themselves. And then when this parliament asks basic questions to hold them accountable for the law that compels Australians to give them money, they refuse to answer them. We want to make sure that Australians can hold their corporates to account. But we have to make sure that we can operate an environment throughout the COVID-19 pandemic so that measures can appropriately be taken. The other provisions in this legislation relate to continuous disclosure rules, which are not viable for civil penalty proceedings unless they've acted with knowledge, recklessness or negligence in failing to update the market. The reason for them is simple, because we have seen how provisions put in acts designed to improve accountability for companies has been used, abused recklessly by law firms and investors who want to turn our system of justice into one for profit. And let's not mistake what happens, Deputy Speaker, when they manipulate our court system for their own ends. It comes at the expense of vulnerable Australians who have a legitimate case for a class action. And when they win that case, the money is taken by law firms who seek to use it for their own profit motive. They claim, the members claim, including the member for Solomon on the other side of this chamber, claim that they're standing up for workers, they're standing up for vulnerable Australians, but all they see is an opportunity to enhance it for themselves. And even worse than that those same firms then take that money and donate it to create laws and to foster laws to protect themselves and their interests, to harvest and to profit from the most vulnerable Australians. Not for accountability, but for profit, so that they can pay their bonuses. And then we see in this chamber the member for Whitlam, and I'm sure other members that will follow, opposing legislation because they know that their paymasters in the union movement and in the law firms, it will undermine their revenue streams at the expense that they take at the expense of vulnerable Australians. We see this time and time again. It is a pattern of behaviour from the modern Australian Labor Party, where they use the law to buffer the profits of financial interests associated with them, and then scream outrage when people seek to inquire how they use that money, how those funds somehow seamlessly seem to transfer money to the campaigns and the activities of the Allies and Labor Party on the other side of this chamber. Of course, in a free society, people should follow the law. But that doesn't excuse the unethical conduct of those opposite. And it also means that people on this side of this chamber have a responsibility to call it out. So they should support these changes in law because they're good changes. They support these changes in law because they enhance the power of Australians to be able to be treated fairly and with decency. And more critically, They stop the use and manipulation of courts for profit over justice. Because that's what courts should be used for, Deputy Speaker. Not political games, not commercial profit, but justice. And we're going to call the end of that racket right here.